All right, buckle up, everybody. We're diving deep into Daoist philosophy today. You guys gave us a ton of great material for this. Deep dive excerpts from Chapter 2 of the Dao De Jing, different commentaries, and even a whole lecture from Dao Master Choo Meng. I think this is going to be really fun to break down together.
Yeah, it's always cool to look at this old wisdom and, see if it still makes sense for us now.
Yeah.
Especially with something like the Dao De Jing, which, can seem so different from the way we think in the West.
I know, right? We're going to be looking at big ideas like duality and the idea of Wu Wei, which is sometimes translated as effortless action. But we're not going to just define words. We're going to dig into what they actually mean, how they connect, and maybe even what they can tell us about how we see the world and how we live.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about Chapter 2 is how Laozi, right away, challenges how we think about reality. He starts off by saying, to know beauty, you got to recognize ugliness. To get skill, you need to know what it looks like to not have skill.
It's like he's saying that opposites define each other. They give each other meaning. We always want to put things in boxes, good and bad, right and wrong. But Laozi's saying maybe it's not so black and white. Maybe it's all more connected than we think.
Right, think about it. Could you really appreciate light if you'd never seen darkness? Would success even feel good if you never had any challenges or any setbacks? Laozi's saying these things that seem opposite are actually just two sides of the same thing.
That's totally what Dao Master Choo Meng was talking about in his lecture. He used the example of a coin, heads and tails. You can't have one without the other. They have to exist together, but we so often just want one and not the other,
Yeah, it makes you think about things differently. Instead of trying to be perfectly good or perfect in any way, Laozi says maybe the key is to embrace how opposites actually work together to show us what's real. And that has some really big implications for how we actually live.
Yeah, okay, so we're seeing how this idea of duality kind of messes with how we usually think. But how does that connect to this Wu Wei, this effortless action idea? It seems kind of contradictory. How can you get anything done if you aren't, trying really hard and pushing for results?
That's where it gets really interesting. See, Wu Wei isn't about just doing nothing. It's more like aligning yourself with how the Tao naturally flows, acting in a way that feels effortless, in harmony with everything. It's kind of like water flowing around a rock. It doesn't fight the rock, it just moves around it, finds a new path.
So it's like working with the natural order instead of trying to force our own way.
Exactly. And to do that, you need a kind of humility, a willingness to let go of your ego and needing to control everything. Laozi even says the sage manages affairs without doing anything, which sounds crazy, but it's pointing to this idea of action without forcing or striving so much.
That's so different from what we're taught about leadership in the West, right? In the West, it's all about ambition, competing with each other, and leaving your mark on the world.
It really is.
Yeah.
Laozi makes us rethink what real success is and what effective action actually looks like. It's not about just power or constantly pushing yourself, but more about finding that place where what you do aligns with the universe's natural flow. And Laozi would say that's how you have a real lasting impact.
You mentioned earlier how Daoist thinking is different from Western thinking, but are there any connections, even if they're surprising? Because it seems like a completely different worldview.
It might surprise you, but there are actually some parallels. Take Wu Wei, for example. It kind of relates to this idea called Hegelian dialectics from this German philosopher Hegel. His idea is that progress happens when opposites clash, like a thesis and antithesis, and then they kind of resolve into this synthesis.
Oh, so it's like opposites working together and creating something new. Yeah, that kind of fits with Laozi's focus on duality, but I'm guessing there's some big differences too, right?
Oh, absolutely. For Hegel, it's all about finding a resolution, that synthesis that goes beyond the conflict. But for Laozi, it's not about resolving that tension between opposites. It's more about embracing the paradox, seeing that connection between things that seem opposite, and understanding that's just part of what's real.
So Hegel's looking for an answer, and Laozi wants us to just live with the questions.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. And that difference in how they approach it really shows a big difference between Western and Eastern thought. The Western mind wants to categorize, define, and resolve. The Eastern mind, like in Taoism, is more okay with ambiguity, with the mystery and paradox of existence.
Okay, so we've got these big ideas, duality, effortless action, and we're seeing how they kind of shake up how we normally think. But I'm curious, like, how does Laozi see all this playing out in real life? How does the sage, that ideal person in Taoism, actually live according to the Tao?
That's a great question, and it's something Laozi talks about directly in chapter 2. He describes the sage as someone who, embodies these principles, duality and Wu Wei, in everything they do, in who they are. And one of the biggest things about the sage is humility.
Humility. That seems weird. We usually think of leaders as assertive and confident, not humble.
I know, right? And that's what makes Laozi's perspective so interesting. He's saying true power doesn't come from your ego or trying to promote yourself. The sage doesn't brag about what they've done or cling to the results. They just act in line with the Tao and things just naturally work out.
He even says in the Dao De Jing, the work is accomplished and there's no resting in it as an achievement. It's like the sage is always moving, going with the flow of the Tao without getting stuck in that ego trip of, look what I did.
Yeah.
And that really challenges how we in the West are so obsessed with individual achievement and legacy.
Exactly. It's a big shift in thinking. It asks us to think about what's really important. What if real fulfillment comes from, aligning yourself with a bigger purpose, acting in a way that's effortless and in harmony, not from getting praise or awards?
This is starting to sound a lot like the idea of non-attachment in Buddhism, like letting go of wanting specific outcomes and just accepting what is.
You're definitely picking up on that connection. Daoist thought and Buddhism have a lot of overlap there. Both traditions say it's important to let go of desires that come from the ego and find peace in the present moment.
So we're seeing how all these seemingly different ideas, duality, effortless action, humility, non-attachment, are actually all connected. They're pointing to a way of being in the world that's totally different from that Western model of striving, achieving, and conquering. But there's one thing I'm still not quite getting.
What's that?
Well, if the sage doesn't want recognition or take credit for what they do, how do they actually influence the world? How do they lead without, telling people what to do or giving commands? Laozi mentions the sage conveys instructions without the use of speech. What does that even mean?
That's where we get into one of the most interesting and maybe the hardest to grasp parts of Taoist leadership. It's not about words or pronouncements. It's about, being the Tao in a way that makes others want to follow. It's about leading by example. And we'll dig into that more in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, now I'm really curious. We've already learned so much from just one chapter of the Dao De Jing, but it sounds like there's even more to discover. I'm excited to learn more about this idea of leadership without words and see what else Laozi has to teach us.
Welcome back. So, before the break, we were talking about this interesting idea, the sage accomplishing great things, but not really caring about getting credit. It's so different from how we usually think about leaders, right?
It really is. We're so used to the leader being the one who takes charge, who makes these big announcements, and who wants to leave their mark on the world. But Laozi's sage seems to be doing something completely different.
Exactly. Laozi sees leadership in a much more subtle, kind of nuanced way. It's not about forcing your ideas on others. It's more about aligning yourself with the Tao, with how things naturally flow, and letting your actions speak for themselves. Remember that line from the Dao De Jing, the one you mentioned? It says, the work is accomplished and there's no resting in it as an achievement. There's no holding on to the results, needing to celebrate yourself or get a pat on the back.
It almost seems like that wouldn't work, right? Wouldn't not focusing on achieving actually make it harder to get things done?
That's the interesting thing. It seems to do the opposite. When you let go of that need to achieve, to control the outcome, you get rid of the anxiety and pressure that come with constantly striving. You become more present, more adaptable, more tuned in to what's actually happening. And it might sound strange, but that often makes you more effective and your actions have a bigger impact.
That reminds me of something I read about peak performance in athletes and artists. They talk about finding a flow state where they kind of lose themselves in what they're doing and everything just works. They're not focused on the result, they're just totally in the moment.
That's a great connection. That flow state is a lot like the Taoist idea of Wu Wei. It's about acting with, a natural grace, letting your actions come from a place of being totally present and in harmony with the Tao.
So it's not about being passive, it's more about finding that perfect spot where action just kind of happens effortlessly because you're in sync with the universe.
Exactly. And when you act from that place, your actions have a power, a kind of resonance that you can't get just from willpower or a strong personality.
Okay, I'm starting to see how all these pieces fit together, but I have to admit, this leading by example thing still feels a bit mysterious. How does the sage actually change the world if they're not, like, directing people or giving orders?
It's definitely a subtle thing, and maybe the easiest way to understand it is through a metaphor. Imagine like a master gardener taking care of their plants. They don't order the plants to grow. They don't force nature to do what they want. Instead, they create the right conditions. They give them water, sunlight, they care for them, and the plants just naturally thrive.
So the sage is like the gardener. They create an environment where people can flourish and become their best selves.
Right. It's not about control or force. It's about making a space where people feel inspired, where they feel empowered, where they all share the same purpose.
And that goes back to the idea of humility, right? The sage isn't focused on their own ego or what they can get out of it. They genuinely care about the well-being of others.
Yeah, for sure. And that humility helps the sage connect with people in a deeper way, because they're not trying to dominate or be better than everyone else. People feel seen, heard, and respected. And that creates trust and authenticity, which are so important for real leadership.
That's such a different kind of power than what we're used to, right? It's not about being in charge or controlling people. It's about helping others find their own strength and wisdom.
Exactly. And this is where Taoism can offer us some really valuable lessons for how to deal with our complicated world today. We live in a society that often values aggression, competition, and promoting yourself. But Laozi's wisdom encourages us to consider a different way, a way of humility, harmony, and effortless action.
It's definitely a challenging path, but it's also incredibly inspiring. But I have to say, this whole leadership without words thing, it's still kind of hard to grasp. It sounds so, I don't know, abstract and mystical. Are there, like, real-world examples of how this actually works?
Well, think about the most inspiring leaders you've known in your own life. Were they the ones who were always the loudest, always giving orders? Or were they the ones who lived their values, who inspired you through their quiet strength and their integrity?
You know, you're right. The people who have had the biggest impact on me were often the ones who led by example. They didn't need to preach or give big speeches. They just lived in a way that made me want to be a better person, to do better things. It was like they were showing me that a different way of being was possible.
Exactly. That's the power of the sage. They live the Tao in such a real, tangible way that becomes inspiring to others. They're not trying to convert anyone or force their beliefs on anyone. They just live in a way that invites others to see things differently, to imagine new possibilities for how to live and lead.
So it's not about telling people what to do. It's about embodying those principles so fully that they, like, radiate outwards and touch the lives of everyone around you.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And that brings us back to this idea of interconnectedness, which is so important in Taoism. Just like a little pebble dropped in a pond creates ripples that spread out, the sage's actions can have a huge impact on the world, even without them trying to make it happen.
It's like that saying, be the change you wish to see in the world. But it's even more than that. It's about being in a way that resonates with, like, the very essence of the universe.
And that, in the end, is what Taoist leadership is all about. It's not about power over other people. It's about aligning yourself with the power of the Tao and letting that power flow through you out into the world.
Wow, this has been such an eye-opening conversation, but I feel like there's still more to explore. We've talked a lot about the sage and Taoist leadership, but I'm curious how all of this applies to us, everyday people just trying to navigate our modern lives. Can we actually live by these ancient principles, even if we're not trying to be sages?
That's a great question, and that's where things get really practical and exciting. Because even though the sage might represent, like, the ideal Taoist wisdom is for everyone. And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll look at some specific ways we can start living these principles and bring the harmony and wisdom of the Tao into our own lives.
I'm really looking forward to that. I'm starting to feel a sense of possibility here. This whole deep dive into Chapter 2 of the Dao De Jing has been amazing. It's challenged my assumptions, made me see things from new angles, and honestly, I'm feeling both humbled and inspired. So welcome back to our deep dive into the Dao De Jing. We've covered a lot of ground. Duality, effortless action, the humility of the sage. But how do we actually use these ancient ideas in our modern lives?
Right, how do we take that ancient wisdom and apply it to, like, all the stuff we deal with in the 21st century? I think the key is to remember Taoism isn't about strict rules or trying to be perfect. It's about, like, finding a way to be that's in tune with the natural flow of life.
It's about aligning ourselves with the Tao, as you've said, but that's kind of abstract. Any, like, practical tips on how we actually do that?
Well, one of the best things is just to start paying more attention. Notice when you're feeling stressed, overwhelmed, out of sync. What's happening in those moments? Are you like fighting against how things are naturally unfolding, holding on too tight to a specific result?
It's like trying to make the river flow in a straight line, like we talked about before. But noticing is just the first step, right? Then what?
Once you see those moments of resistance, try to gently, guide yourself back to a place of ease. Take a deep breath, maybe let go of needing to control everything, or just admit to yourself, okay, I'm not in the flow right now.
So it's not about ignoring those feelings, it's more about like acknowledging them and being curious about them.
Exactly. And remember, this is a process. It takes time. It's not about being perfectly detached all the time. It's about like gently nudging yourself back into alignment with the Tao when you realize you've drifted away.
It's like we're learning a new dance, and it takes practice to get the rhythm, the flow.
I like that. And just like learning any new skill, you got to be patient, stick with it, and be okay with making mistakes along the way.
Okay, so being more aware is key. Any other things we can do to bring those Daoist ideas into our lives?
Well, think about those qualities of the sage. Humility, non-attachment, effortless action. Those aren't just ideas, they're things we can cultivate in ourselves moment by moment. Like when you're facing a tough situation, instead of reacting right away or trying to force things to go your way, ask yourself, what would the sage do?
That's a great idea. It's like having an inner mentor helping us find a more harmonious way to be. But what about Wu Wei, that effortless action? How does that work in like everyday situations?
Okay, let's say you're totally swamped with deadlines at work. Instead of pushing yourself until you burn out, what if you stopped and asked, what's the most effortless way I can approach this? Maybe it means breaking the project into smaller chunks, asking for help, or just taking a break and coming back to it later with fresh energy.
So it's not about avoiding work, it's about finding a better, more sustainable way to get it done.
Yeah, exactly. And you can apply that to anything, relationships, creative stuff, even how you talk to yourself in your head. Instead of constantly pushing and striving, what if you just let yourself go with the natural flow of life?
Like trading the bulldozer for a sailboat, like you said before. We're not trying to force our way through, we're learning to use the wind and currents to our advantage.
And that takes trust, right? Trusting yourself, trusting the process, and trusting that even when things feel uncertain, there's this underlying order and harmony at work.
It's a beautiful way to think about things, and I have to say it's pretty different from how we're usually taught to think and act, but I can see how a more effortless, harmonious approach to life could be really appealing.
And it's not about doing it perfectly, all at once. We don't have to instantly become sages. Every little step we take toward aligning with the Dao, it's a step towards more peace, more fulfillment, more effectiveness in our lives.
This has been such a rich, thought-provoking journey into the Dao De Jing. It's amazing how a text that old can still speak to us so powerfully today.
It really shows you how timeless those teachings are. And as we've seen, these aren't just theories, they're practical things we can use to navigate the ups and downs of our modern lives.
So to everyone listening, take these ideas and see how they fit into your experience. Pick up the Dao De Jing, play around with these principles in your daily life, and just see what happens. You might be surprised by what you discover when you let go and let the Dao lead the way. Until next time, may you find harmony and flow in everything you do.